Okay, so I made this video hopefully to make the Roland XV-5080 a little more approachable for someone who is coming into this wanting to do more than just use the available patches, the factory patches and sounds that come with the thing. I'm not here to talk about how to edit patches and create patches and do those sorts of things, but if you're someone who's been really daunted by the lack of information on the internet about how to actually get samples onto the Roland, and how to use samples. Same goes for patches. Like if you didn't make any of these patches yourself, but you downloaded a sample pack from someone who programmed a bunch of samples, and you're trying to figure out how to best get that onto the Roland, and also to just how to manage all these different types of data. That's what this video is for. So I'll timestamp things as best I can, so you can skip around if things are starting to bore you or there's specific parts you need. But the TLDR version is what I'll start with here in this video, and let's just get right into it. So the XV5080 has 4 modes. It's got patch mode, performance mode, rhythm mode, and GM mode. So patch mode basically is patches. So patches are either 4-tone patches, meaning that a patch is a single sound made up of 4 different tones, or they're multi-partial patches. Multi-partial patches are made up of constituent sounds called partials, which are assigned to a maximum of 88 keys and contain the settings for the parameters needed for the performance. When loading patches from a CD-ROM or other source, these are automatically treated as multi-partial patches. So you may ask, what is a tone? There's 4 tones that make up a patch for 4-tone patches, and the smallest unit of a 4-tone patch is called a tone. So although a sound could be created using simply 1 tone, the XV5080 handles the sounds used for the performance in terms of patches, which are a combination of a number of tones. In other words, tones are the components of sound from which patches are composed. So that's kind of a no-shit Sherlock summary of kind of like what I just said, but I read that straight from the manual. So I'll do the same thing for a partial. So what is a partial? Partials are combinations of up to 4 samples with a number of other parameters added, such as setting of loop points to wave data, and that compromise the sounds from which multi-partial patches are composed. So yeah, there you can see that a partial is slightly different than a tone. So yeah, patch mode lets you play patches on whatever MIDI controller you're using, whether that's a keyboard or otherwise. So now performance mode uses performances, and performances are sounds made of layered patches. So they can combine a total of up to 32 separate patches and rhythm sets to enjoy ensemble performances featuring rich tones. In other words, using performances allows you to control 32 separate tones at one time. So a sound module that can simultaneously produce multiple sounds is called a multi-timbral sound module. Performances are combinations of up to 32 patches, like I said, split and or layered in any way that you want. So in this mode, the XV5080 functions as a multi-timbral sound generator, and performance settings can be modified too. So if you're using an external MIDI device to control the XV5080 in this mode, it will function as a multi-timbral sound generator. So now rhythm mode, I'm not going to read out of the manual. It's as simple as this. It turns your keyboard into a percussion kit. There's nothing more to say about that. Each note is assigned a percussion sample. And then there's GM mode, which is the 4th mode. And in my opinion, for the purposes of this video, this mode is not really important, but for the sake of posterity, I'll run through it. So GM mode is General MIDI 2 mode. General MIDI, regular General MIDI, not General MIDI 2, is a set of recommendations which seeks to provide a way to go beyond the limitations of proprietary designs and standardize the MIDI capabilities of sound-generating devices. Sound-generating devices and music files that meet the General MIDI standard, which is a General MIDI logo, I guess, they bear that logo. So music files bearing the General MIDI logo can be played back using any General MIDI sound generating unit to produce essentially the same musical performance. General MIDI 2, however, is similar to General MIDI, but the major changes are as follows. General MIDI 2 compliant sound modules or keyboards must be 32 voice as opposed to just 24. They must have 256 patches or programs as opposed to just 128, and have many more defined continuous controllers. Specific controller definitions can be found on the MIDIMA site. Oh, I'm out of fucking breath. So overall, GM2 offers enhanced expressive capabilities and even greater compatibility. Issues that were not covered by the original General MIDI recommendations, such as how sounds are to be edited, how effects should be handled, have now been precisely defined as of 2000, whatever, when this manual was written. Moreover, the available sounds have been expanded. General MIDI 2 compliant sound generators are capable of reliably playing back music files that carry either the General MIDI or General MIDI 2 logo. In some cases, the conventional form of General MIDI, which does not include the new enhancements, is referred to as General MIDI 1 as a way of distinguishing it from General MIDI 2. So, like I said, I don't think it's really important to get into this, but I guess the moral of the story is that the Roland XV-5080 is general MIDI 2 compatible. Talked about the 4 different modes that you can operate in on the Roland XV-5080. Let's talk about its data organization or architecture. So the XV-5080 reads and loads data from either internal memory or external memory, or from an external MIDI device. So internal memory sources can be either the factory preset library, which is protected library of factory patches that will always be there when you do a factory reset. You can't get rid of them. And they're stored inside the Roland XV-5080's fucking circuitry. There's also, similarly, there's also the factory user library. That's it's the user library, not the preset library. And although these are presets, it's labeled as a button on the machine as user. And if you press user, then you're in a library that, although it will be there when you do a factory reset, just like the preset library will, the difference is that these are unprotected, meaning that you can, it's treated as almost like a temporary data pool that you can rip patches out of and put patches in at your will. Think of it as a vacant slot that you can fill and empty at any time. So then there's also another form of internal memory called SIMM boards, and what these are, SIMM. And there's 2 slots underneath the cover panel of the Roland XV-5080. You unscrew that top panel, and you can insert these boards. Each of them are 64 megabytes, so you can decide to not insert any. The machine will still play regular factory presets library and factory user library, no problem, without any SIMM boards inserted. But if you insert both of them, you have a total of 128 megabytes. And what this is it's a temporary vessel that stores patches, performances, rhythm sets, and other settings that are different from the factory user or preset type of libraries. And you can operate the factory user and preset libraries, like I said, without any SIMM boards installed. And you can read data from external memory sources like cards and disks that you hook up to it without the SIMM boards installed. However, you can't actually load any of that data. So you can view it when you're menu diving and looking at what disks or memory cards you have inserted, but you can't actually load any of that data without a SIMM board, because the Roland needs that as like a middleman, as a temporary slot, for it to, like a platter for you to put the food on for it to eat. Okay, so we've gone over factory presets, factory user patches. We've gone over SIMM boards. So now let's talk about EXP, expansion boards. So what these are is, again, if you open up the top panel, you can choose to insert 0 of these things, or you can insert up to 8 of them. And all they are is they're like these expansion boards that store both patches and individual tones / waveforms that you can use to create your own patches. So these are things that have become pretty rare nowadays. Like there's some floating around on eBay, but back in the day, I guess, you'd have to buy these separately from the XV-5080 and collect them, Okay, so now let's talk about external memory sources. So there's 2 main types of drives. Whenever you want to access external data, you'll go into disk mode on the Roland. There's a button called disk, and this allows you to scan any different drives that are hooked up to it. So there's 2 different types of drives. Like I said, there's card, and then there's disk. So card refers to data that is read through the memory card slot on the front of the panel. And this takes these kind of old school cards called smart media cards, which are not the same thing as the modern day SD cards. And they're not that hard to find. You can still buy them, but they're in 32 megabyte, 64 megabyte, and 128 megabyte sizes. So then there's a disk type of drives. And what this is it's data that's read through the SCSI port. I'm just going to use the word SCSI for the rest of the video, but what SCSI is SCSI. I don't know what the fuck that stands for, but it's like some old nerd shit. And basically, the SCSI port in the back is for SCSI disk drives, which are these old school disk, like physical disk drives that you insert either CDs or floppies, and those CDs and floppies contain the data that you want to read. And the thing about the Roland XV-5080 is that it can read up to 7 of these SCSI drives, so you can select in the menu which one you want to pick to read from. And the thing about those old school SCSI drives is you could chain them together. So in theory, you could buy 7 of these SCSI drives, which are really hard to find nowadays, if you can find any that are both the right format or in working condition. But yeah, you could theoretically buy 7 of these things, chain them all together, and the Roland would be able to read it as one set of 7 different drives that you could read. Okay, so and then there's also MIDI data that is technically an external source of data. And basically, the difference between MIDI data and reading from drives is that with MIDI data, you're force feeding it into the Roland. You're not selecting whether the Roland wants to taste it or eat it. So beyond normal MIDI functions like program changes, tempo and clock data, etc., this allows you to also force feed patches into the user library. So like I said, that user library is open and available for you to load external data. So just to reiterate too, the XV-5080's menu screen organizes external devices as drives, like I said, where you choose to read and load data from. And that type of data is, patch data, performance data, sample data, rhythm set data, etc. MIDI source data is not read as a drive, but is instead handled in its own way. And I'm going to talk about in this video later, you can look at timestamps, but I'm going to talk about loading patches via programs like MIDI aux and XV Librarian. But yeah, think of MIDI as food that is force-fed into the Roland. The Roland doesn't have control of what food is coming into it or how fast or how much of it. It can just decide whether or not it wants to open or close its mouth to being force-fed that MIDI or not. And you would control that via system or utility settings. Okay, so now let's talk about samples. So the factory manuals that come with the Roland XV-5080 do a really, really shitty job of talking about samples. But after all the homework I've done on the internet and forums and videos and manuals, what I've learned is this. So understand, there is no sample mode. Think of samples as playable data that you can load into the aforementioned modes, performance, patch, rhythm, and GM. The XV-5080 is not a sampler. It's a sample playback synth capable of loading and using these types of formats: Roland S770, S750, S760, Akai data, like the Akai S1000 and 3000 series, and also WAV files and AIFF files. So the simplest workflow that you can organize on the XV-5080, in my opinion, is to have a patch loaded, in the user library of patch mode that assigns different samples to different keyboard notes. So ideally, you want to format sample packs if you're putting them together yourself or organizing them into folders yourself on a computer. Ideally, you want to format these packs as patches to save you time. Because if your sample packs are formatted as sound files, like .wav files, that we typically understand, then you have to do the labor of creating your own patches that contain these waveforms and then assigning them to the keys and yada, yada, yada. But some sample packs are formatted for sampler hardware to save you that time. So back in the 90s, you could buy floppy disks or CD-ROM formats for Akai or EMU or MPC samplers. And if you can get a hold of these types of CDs and burn them to your computer or read them directly with a SCSI drive, to get those files, those sampler hardware formats that are written to those disks usually means that the MIDI notes trigger individual waveforms already, so you don't have to do that. They trigger sound loops. So like I said, you ideally want each key on your keyboard to just trigger a different sample. So these sampler hardware-specific sample packs that I talked about with those old school disks are the best ones that you can try to buy or pirate or download. And the next best thing you can do if you want to make loading samples easy is to buy a software. I know, but buy a software called, it's made by Chicken Systems and it's called Translator 7. So Translator 7 is software that lets you format your sample packs into many different types of sampler formats or other formats. So for example, I can format an Akai sample disk and format that into the Roland XV-5080 patch format, such that your sampler packs or disks or folders are translated into what are called SVD files. That's .svd. Roland uses these files called SVDs, which for the sake of this video or simplicity, we can just call setups, right? So each SVD setup contains data for performances, patches, or rhythm modes. It's a whole block of data, and the XV-5080 can only run one of these setups at a time. So ideally, each patch is crafted to where each note on the keyboard triggers a different sample. Right? That's what I said before. So furthermore, ideally, if you can, you should plan to organize your samples such that they are loading as many samples into each patch as you can, and then loading as many patches into each SVD setup as you can. So in other words, you want, ideally, because what will happen is, hold on a sec, let me gather my thoughts here. So yeah, so this can only be done if you have a sampler folder adjacent to your SVD file that contains every waveform that patch draws from. So this is probably not the case, but if it is the case, then proceed to the next clause. So if that is the case, then ideally you can group different genres of sample packs into separate SVD setups, whatever you decide to call a genre. So, whether that's like jazz fusion or snare drum beats, whatever you decide. So when you load the SVD setup into the XV-5080, it replaces all the user performance, patch, and rhythm data, like I said, So unless I'm mistaken, you can only fit 128 patches into the user bank. So make sure that you remember not to stack beyond 128 patches into each genre SVD that you make. Skip ahead because we'll get into the fine details of loading samples later in this video and how to organize that data. Like I said before too, make sure before you dive into samples with this thing that you take the proper precautions, and that is to have enough SIMM memory, and open up the top panel and make sure that you have a SIM card or 2 SIM cards inserted, because on the display of the Roland, the manual kind of lies, because at least in my experience, according to the manual, there will just be like a slash mark through where it says available SIM data if you don't have a card inserted, but mine said 0 megabytes or 0 kilobytes. So what that told me is that, oh, okay, I do have a card inserted, but it's just full. But that wasn't the case. There was no card inserted at all. So I had to buy 2 new cards and insert them. Another precaution you want to take is not all smart media cards that load into the memory card slot will work. I'm not sure what the reasons for that are, but like I bought one from this guy on eBay that was 128 megabytes, and I was getting a improper disk error when I tried to load it as a disk. I just bought a brand new one from Amazon that was 32 megabytes, and now it's working fine. So yeah. So I'll get into the reasons why later in the video, but with what I'm doing in my studio with making music is my setup with the Roland XV-5080 is to use the smart media card that you insert in the memory card slot for storing patch libraries as separate files, as separate SVD files. I don't fuck with samples with smart media card. I use the SCSI Drive input on the back of it. I use SCSI drives to handle storing samples, and I'll get into the reasons why later in the video. But you plan on having that be your mentality if you're wanting to both load third-party patches and also load samples. Yeah, now we're gonna launch right into it, and I'm gonna talk to you about the best way to store and load samples. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about how to load patches from your computer onto the Roland XV-5080. So the first thing you should do is you should download 2 programs, and I'll get into why here in a sec, but you want to download a program called MIDI aux, link in the description, and a program called XV Editor, which also includes XV Librarian. They're technically 2 different programs, but they come in the same download folder from the Roland website, which I've linked also in the description. So when you're on the Roland page, you want to click that if you've got PC, or click that if you've got Mac. It's called XV Editor. Okay. The next thing you're going to want to do is buy one of these. It's a USB 2 MIDI out cable thing. Okay, so this is just a USB cable that plugs into your computer, and then it goes out to it splits into 2 MIDI cables, and you can't just get some random shitty one from eBay or from China or whatever. It kind of has to be either a Roland. It's kind of random which brands work and which don't, but like I've heard a lot of people complain that they'll buy one of these cables from kind of like an off brand, and it won't work. So just be safe and get the fucking Roland one, even though it is a little more expensive. It's like $40, which is kind of painful, but so what you're going to do is you're going to connect that from your computer to the back of the XV-5080. There's 2 MIDI inputs, or there might be 3, but just like, I'm not sure if all the MIDI inputs will work, but in the case of what I'm doing right now is this thing already is receiving MIDI into its MIDI input from a master clock device. So I inserted the USB MIDI cable into input number 2, okay? And it's counterintuitive, but like both of these cables, you can't see it in the picture on the website, but one is labeled in and the other is labeled out. Now this is really counterintuitive, but the one that's labeled out will get plugged into in on the Roland, right? And then the one that's labeled out on the USB cable, MIDI cable thing, will get plugged into the input, in my case input 2, on the Roland. Next thing you want to do is make sure that you have the right settings set up on the Roland. So you make sure you're in user mode, because the way that this synth works is when you're in patch mode, or sorry, when you're when you're in preset mode, you're using the internal memory of this thing from the factory with patches that cannot be removed, right? When you're in user mode, you are using factory patches as well, that when you do a factory reset on this thing, like those user patches will reboot and be there even if you accidentally delete all of them. But the difference is that these patches can come and go. You can swap these out for other patches, unlike the factory presets. So what we're going to do is load a third-party bank of patches that I downloaded. Before we can load any patches onto this thing, we have to make sure that there are some settings in place that will allow us to do transfers, right? So what we'll do is we'll go to System Utility, press it twice, so it's blinking. Okay, and then go to Protect, hit F5, and you want to make sure that Internal Write Protect is turned off, right? And then you also want to make sure System Exclusive Protect is turned off. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to go to System instead of Utility. So, and now you're going to go over to MIDI, F3, and make sure your MIDI settings are set up so that you can do these system exclusive transfers. So you want to make sure all the other settings are going to be default, but what you want to do is make sure that device ID is 17. That might be default, I'm not sure. Receive SW is on. You want to make sure that MIDI TX edit data is on. Okay. Okay, so what you want to do before you proceed with loading patches to go into the user bank is you want to back up the original factory ones. Like I said, if you do a factory reset, they'll all still be there, but you still might just want to have them for whatever reason. So I'll show you the steps for backing up them to both MIDI aux and XV Librarian. So why would you want to have both of these programs instead of just one? Well, here is the reason. So the XV Librarian program does not load system exclusive types of files, also known as sysx, which is .syx. So I'm going to call them sysx files for the rest of the video, but it only lets you transfer, this program only lets you transfer .smf files and .svu files. So the ones that we're going to be using to accomplish what we want to do here is .smf, right? So the thing is the Roland XV-5080 deals with both sysx files and SMF files. I don't know like the nerdy fucking details, but I'm just going to show you how to do both in case you want sysx files too. I know that the traditional way with all these Roland synths from the 80s and 90s is that you do sysx dumps to dump patches from your synth to another synth or a computer, or vice versa. And so that's why people might be more comfortable with the sysx format. But yeah, here we go. So after you install the Librarian program, like when you're doing the install, make sure you do the custom install to only install the Roland XV-5080 version of the software and not the other synths, unless you own the other synths. I don't remember what they are, but there's like a couple of other synths that this program works for. So yeah, open up the program, which I've done, and in the top row, you're going to click MIDI, right? And then set up MIDI devices. Sorry, you're going to go to setup and set up MIDI devices, my bad. And what you want to do is make sure that since we're using the USB MIDI cable, that twin-headed one that you have for the XV-5080 for input and output, you have USB MIDI set for both. Device ID is 17, like we talked about before. And then for through, you can make those also USB MIDI interface for both in and out. Okay. And then, so on the Roland XV-5080, make sure that you're in user mode, right? Okay. So in XV Librarian in the MIDI tab, you're going to click read all data. And what that's going to do is it reads all the performance, patch, rhythm, set, and multi-timbre, however you say that. It reads all that data indicated in the main window from the sounds module from the Roland's user area. So the read all button that's over here performs that same exact function. Yeah, we want to import the entire user library. So we're going to do read all. Click OK. And yeah, you can see that it is doing the transfer. And you can see them populating the window over here, you can see that these are the names of the actual patches. So yeah, it's working. It might take a while to load all of them, but yeah, you'll see. Yep. And on the screen here, it's saying now transmitting system exclusive, and our MIDI green light is on, so you know it's transmitting that data. Okay, so all of our transfers just went through. So now that they're all loaded into the librarian, we're going to go to File, and we're going to do Export SMF, and we're going to select all data. Okay. And you're going to choose on your computer where you want to save it and name it whatever you want, right? And you're going to save it. I already did save it, so that's why I'm not going to do that. But now you have a an SMF version of your user bank backed up. So I'm going to show you how to back up the actual SysX version of those files of the user bank, right? So since the XV librarian doesn't deal with SysX, we got to use MIDI aux because it primarily deals with SysX. So what you'll do is first, before you can do any transfers, you want to configure MIDI aux. So for your MIDI inputs, you'll go up here to open this window. You'll fucking click this blue. It's hard to see, but it's like a blue MIDI cable icon right there. It's like dark blue or black, I can't tell. And you'll select your MIDI inputs. In this case, like before, we're using the USB MIDI interface. And for MIDI output, we'll select the same thing. Okay. All right. So now what you're going to do is you're going to go to View, and we're going to click SysX, and it's going to open up the SysX View and Scratchpad window. That's what this is. Okay. You're going to click the tab that says SysX, right? And you're going to go to Receive Manual Dump, and it automatically brought up this window that tells me where it wants to save it. So you'll name it whatever you want, and you'll click Save. But what you need to do in order for that to happen is you need to first click Configure, and you want to check this final box that says Save Dump Directly to a File. You want to make sure you do that first. Okay. Let's run this through. So we're going to click, like I said, Receive Manual Dump. Let's just call it fucking whatever. I already saved it, so I don't care about naming it something. This is just a test, right? So I'm just going to save it on my desktop. Okay, now look, it's saying waiting for completion or whatever. It's waiting to receive data. So I'm going to go back over to our Roland, right, and initiate the transfer. So we're going to click System Utility twice to be in utility mode. We're going to go to Menu 2, and we're going to click Data Transfer F1, right? And this is where you'll specify the source and the destination. So the source is user, that's our user bank, and then our destination is MIDI through the MIDI cables. So we're going to, that's all good, so we're going to hit F6 transfer, and now you can see the patches being transferred. And this is going to take a long time. That should be, that's to be expected. And if we look over here at MIDI aux, we can see the files being transferred. Okay, so the file transfer completed, and you press done when all the data's gone through, and you'll just see both of these are going to be blank. Now, if you had not have checked the box that's in the configure section, if you had left this box unchecked, what would happen is it wouldn't save, and you'd see the actual data populating this display window in the bottom. All that SysX data, it's a bunch of like zeros and ones and like nerd shit that would be down here. But yeah, this should all be blank if you've checked the auto save option, right? Okay, so while we've got MIDI aux still open, now we're going to go into how to transfer patches from the computer to the Roland. So there's like, we're going to do the reverse of what I just showed you with both MIDI aux and for XV Librarian. I'm going to show you how to load SysX files onto it, and I'm also going to show you how to load .smf files onto it. So for the SysX files and MIDI aux, we're going to, like before, we have this window open, and what we're going to do is load a SysX file first, right? So you can drag and drop it, or you can open it. So but yeah, you'll drag your SysX file into the command window here. Then you're going to click File, Send, File, Send SysX file. Okay, yeah, so it might ask you to pick the file here. So if that's the case, load your file, find wherever you saved it. Okay, so once you've done that, as soon as you click the file that you selected, it'll start transferring it immediately. And we can see that even though the Roland won't tell us it's receiving that sysx dump, if you look over here, that MIDI message light is blinking. So yeah, it's eating up whatever is being fed to it right now. And like before, we want to make sure that I don't know if it really matters, but you want to be in user and not preset mode, I would think. So yeah, and it's going to take a really long time to do it this way. This way actually takes the longest as far as wait time goes. That took like fucking 8 minutes or something. But you'll see your whatever old patch you had before will still be there, but as soon as you turn the dial, it'll show the new patches. So you should see new patches there. Now I'm going to show you how to load samples onto the Roland from the computer with the librarian program using SMF files. So I've got the XV librarian program open now, so we're going to go to File, and you're not going to choose Open, which is what is intuitive. You're actually going to choose Import SMF. And you're going to click OK, and then you're going to select the file. And it's going to load it all there. If you try to click Open, for whatever reason, it'll say that it can't load this type of file. I don't know what's up with that, but yeah, just make sure you click Import SMF. So it imported that full bank, all 128 patches. And now what you're going to do is you're going to click Write, and you're going to click All. And you're going to click OK. And now you can see that it's transferring patches. And it's going way quicker than when we tried to do a sysx dump. And our MIDI light is on. It's not blinking this time. It's just a constant. It's just staying a solid green color. But rest assured, the data is being transferred. Okay, so now we've got all those custom patches loaded into the user bank. And because we've replaced the original Roland factory ones with these new custom ones, right? But ideally, I want to keep all those Roland factory ones accessible. So I want those to actually be in my user bank, and I want these new patches to be somewhere else. So we're going to put them on the smart media card here. So, okay, so you're going to go to disk mode, and we're going to click F2 for save data. We're going to click drive and make sure that our card is selected. You're going to click save, and you can now name the file. And I'm just going to leave whatever name is here. I don't really care. And now it's saying writing. Okay, so I did a factory reset to put the original Roland user patches in the user bank. So now I'm going to show you how to load whatever you just saved onto that memory card. And in the case of what we did is we saved an SVD file, which as far as I understand is a whole setup, which includes patches, settings, samples, and some other shit. But we're just focused on loading patches, so that's like the scope of what I'm working with here. We're going to go to load from that card, we're going to click disk, and we're going to click load. And we're going to click drive to select our drive. We're going to select the card. Okay, now we're going to click select. And it loaded it, right? It actually didn't load it yet. You gotta look, it's in super fine fucking print, but it said select there a second ago when we pressed F6, and now it says load. So we didn't actually load it. We have to press F6 again. And it's going to ask us to overwrite all that shit. And you can see that it's, the user performance, the user patches, the user rhythm. I'm going to click OK. Okay, now let's see if that worked. Go to exit. Yeah, cool. So these are our custom patches. So yeah, that worked out. Okay, so now that we've learned how to do that, I think it's time to talk about like what a smart setup for you might be. So maybe this isn't the smartest setup, but I'm a fucking like dumb jock using this thing, and what I think is probably the best idea is to rather than having to do a factory reset to bring about the original Roland factory patches, I think it's smart to save both your custom patches as separate SVD files onto the smart media card. Like any bank that you get, that either you create or you get from some other person that you want to access and pull up like as a whole bank at a time. Rather than individual patches at a time, it's best to save those as separate SVDs onto this card. So what I've gone ahead and done, while we're at it, I'll show you when you're in disk mode, and if you want to do things like delete those SVD files or rename them, you'll go to Tool. Like before we would format the card with F1, but if you look down here, we can rename shit, we can delete shit, copy and move shit, blah, 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 blah. So it's good to know about that to manage the files that are on this card. So what we're going to go ahead and do is I've already created an SVD file for this onto this card. So I'm going to factory reset this thing to bring back the user patches, and then I'm going to save those original Roland user patches as an SVD on this so that I can decide to load either the custom patches, or I can decide to load like I can choose to load the Roland user patches too if I want. Okay, so I did a factory reset. We've got the original factory user patches. I'm going to go to disk mode. I'm going to click F2 for save, and I'm going to click drive to select and make sure we've selected the card, and we're going to click save, because right now I renamed in tool mode that those custom patches I named them Kronos, because that's the guy that made the patches. It's this Russian guy called Kronos. I don't remember his real name, but yeah, we're not selecting Kronos. We're gonna name this factory. So let me do that. So I just wrote it. I wrote that to the memory card. So now if you look, we've got Kronos and factory. So I can boot any of these up at whim. So just to test this out, let's go back to disk mode, and we're going to go to load this time, and we're going to select which one we want. So let's load Kronos. Select, load. Yep, so now let's just to kind of reiterate shit here, let's just do that one more time and load our factory patches. Let me unselect that. Sorry. Yeah. Factory. Select. Okay. Because keep in mind, if you press select, there'll be a check mark. So make sure you just have the thing checked that you want and not some other thing. So load. Cool. Yep. So it brought back our factory patches. So that's the quickest way to basically just have a whole host of SVDs on this card. And like I said before, the SVDs, it's not just patch libraries. It's also performance settings and a bunch of other things. To be clear, an SVD is basically like a setup, which includes all the patches, performances, and samples. So in my opinion, if you're trying to keep things basic and user-friendly, it's best to just think of to just load whole setups, whole SVDs at a time, rather than trying to nitpick little individual things to try to archive in special places and blah, blah, blah. It's best to just load whole libraries at a time, or whole sample setups at a time. Like, to just, when you turn this machine on, to already have it in, like, let's say you have a setup for having all your African bongo drums queued up as your samples with your Dreamy Crystal Cosmos custom patch library for like for an album you're recording that just uses those sounds. It's best to just load that whole setup from the card, rather than trying to like nitpick and cherry pick like what individual things you want on a setup and have to like do that every time you turn the machine on. You know what I mean? And let me just reiterate too, the scope of this video. I don't know if I've like reiterated it enough or at all, but like the scope of this video is not to show you how to maximize the potential of this Roland XV-5080. What I'm trying to do is just make it, I'm just trying to put in layman's terms how to do things that the manual isn't very clear about, which is, in my case, loading patches and samples. So, and just like data management in general. If you really want to learn how to maximize the potential of this thing, the online article called Sound on Sound has like this 4-part like case study on the XV-5080 that shows you how to like most efficiently max out this thing's like potential if you're trying to like use all of its features. But from my perspective, for what I'm trying to do, which is load patches that I like, have as many patches as I want stored externally on a card, and to access a big fat library of samples whenever I want. To me, the most efficient way to do that I know of is to use the card to store your setups, and have whatever setups you save just be patch focused, not sample focused or performance focused or whatever. Just think of this as just a way to store all your user libraries, where each library is 128 unique patches, right? And then the SCSI drive in the back, which is hooked up to the Zulu device, which holds the SD card. The SD card can hold way more data than the smart media card, because this is old technology. It holds 32 megabytes, and 64 megabyte cards might work, 128 megabyte cards might work, but these smart media cards are not the same thing as an SD card. The SD card, can hold up to 128 gigabytes, not megabytes of data. So and another thing is you can't organize folders on a smart media card with the with this Roland device. It won't let you create folders. So to me, it just makes sense to just have each file that you can select on here be a sample library, even though it's not. It's a whole setup, and which includes all the different things that I said. But just think of these as patch libraries that you're loading, patch banks. There's no folders to dive through. It's just detrimental to think of it that way. Whereas the SD card, you can navigate through folders on this thing. When you load the SCSI Drive, it allows you to access whatever folders you created onto that SD card. So I think it makes a lot more sense to organize samples. You're going to want to be a lot more specific with the way you organize samples. You might be organizing them based on like beats per minute, or like what type of music genre those samples are, all kinds of things. Whereas a patch library is a patch library that speaks for itself. There's nothing more to organize, you know what I mean? So the easiest and most efficient way to fuck with sampling on the Roland XV-5080 in the year of our Lord 2024 is to buy this one device. It's currently your best bet, and I'll get into that here. So I'll include the link to the product in the description, along with any other things that you may have to buy throughout the course of this video. But basically, this company called ZuluSCSI, SCSI, which we're going to call SCSI for the remainder of the video. I guess that's how you pronounce it. Slash Sampler Zone. I don't know which company owns who, but basically, they have made this product that is a lot better of a way to import samples than the SCSI Drive that you used to have to buy back in like the late 90s and 2000s. The old SCSI drives were these things that they were basically just CD-ROM drives that you would plug into your sampler that would rip CDs. And the downside with that is you can only have one CD in those at a time. But in this world we live in now of SD cards, you can store way more files, and you can organize them into subfolders however you want. And you may not be able to do that with every kind of sampler, but with the Roland XV-5080, it's able to display those folders in the menu diving and recognize them. So the reason why you want to buy this one and not their other Zulu devices, you want to make sure you buy the V6.4. And the reason why that is, why that works best with the sampler I have is with this device, you are not converting the files down to image or ISO files with this version. You can just load regular old WAV files or .aiff files, whatever your sampler reads, and the Zulu does the homework in between. This version, unlike the others, also has a USB-C port. So that means while the device is hooked up to your sampler, you can also plug in the USB cable between your computer and the device, and you can view the entirety of the SD card that you have inserted into the device. So, and you can even have multiple drive IDs if you so choose, but that's not recommended for the Roland XV-5080, and I'll get into that. But basically, from your computer, you can then read and write to it directly. That way you don't have to shuttle the SD card back and forth to and from the computer. So that's why you want to make sure you get the V6.4. And they may improve this model as the months or years go by, but this is the most current, best way to do that. So basically, when you go to this page to buy it, you can select whatever color you want for the housing, and you select your sampler. In my case, it's the Roland XV-5080. And the cable type, the Roland XV-5080 uses a 25-pin DB25 type of SCSI port. So I'm going to choose the 3-foot length just because that works with my studio. And then this last option here is a switcher box that you can choose to add on to it. And you can do a 2-way with 2 cables or a 4-way with 4 cables included. And I chose not to do this, but this is, if you have like 2 samplers, you can share the Zulu device with them using the 2 or 4-way SCSI switcher. But in my case, I don't need to do that. I just want to have this one device to read one SD card, and that will give me, plenty of folders of samples that I could ever wish to use. So yeah, I think this thing is definitely worth it to buy. It's going to be your best option to efficiently import samples into the Roland XV-5080. The one thing I'll say, the only issue I have with this device is the build quality of the housing, and I'm going to talk about that at the very, very, very end of this video. As much as I don't like to leave things on a stinky note, I also don't want to get into that in the meat of this video, and we'll just save that shit for the end if you're curious or not. So I will also include a link to this page too. You don't need to buy it, but it's a software that you want to make sure you download. And I don't think this step of the whole process is reiterated as well as the other steps online. But you, even though when you buy the Zulu device, they optimize it for whatever sampler you tell them you want it optimized for. You know, in my case, the Roland XV-5080. But like, you still need to do one final step, and that is to format your SD card for more than 2 GB. So yeah, like I said, I've included the link, but it's up here. ZuluSCSI.com/v6, and you want to navigate down to the utility program. You'll click that, and it will download it to your computer. And basically, but yeah, like despite whatever sampler you have the Zulu company set you up for, you still need to use this utility program, because if not, by default, the default setting of the device has only one disk ID enabled. And I'm not sure how all samplers are, but I know with the Roland XV-5080, it recognizes like up to 6 or 7 disk IDs, right? So these things are named as ID0, ID1, ID2, ID3, ID4, ID5, ID6, ID7, and all set by default with only a 2 GB device size. So for the Roland XV-5080 specifically, this just so happens to be fine for only using one of these disk device IDs, because by default, only one is enabled, like I said. But you will still surely want to set the device size to more than just 2 GB, right? Because if you're using a 32 GB SD card or a 64 GB SD card, the Roland XV-5080 will still only recognize it as 2 GB through the Zulu device. So that's why you want to use this utility program to increase that. So I'll show you how to do that. So right now, I've got the Zulu motherboard unmounted from the 3D printed housing device, because I was not able to get this cable to connect, and that's why when I first started to try to run the utility program, it wouldn't recognize the Zulu device at all. And it's because even though I got a red blink when I plug in the USB-C cable, if you don't get this green light, which you can only see inside of the housing, you can't see it from the outside, then your device isn't actually connected. The other thing you want to do is, if you do manage to find a USB cable that will fit into this hole, or if you just take it out of the housing like I did and do it that way, you also want to make sure that your PC or Mac or whatever you're using is identifying and reading the drive and recognizing it. And I'll show some screenshots of what that should look like, in, with my case, Windows 10. So this is what the Zulu V6 utility program will look like when you have it downloaded. So we'll go ahead and open that. Click run. And so the first thing you want to look for is at this bottom bar. It says the firmware version of the device, if it's successfully plugged in. If your computer's not reading the device for whatever reason, this bottom bar will say searching for device. So make sure that it's being recognized before you can proceed. Because if the device isn't recognized, you can look at all this shit. And because it shows a serial number and all these other identifying kinds of numbers, it'll make you think upon first glance that it is looking at your device, but it's actually not. So after you've opened this and you've gotten it to recognize that you do have your Zulu device plugged in, you want to read the SD card. And I don't have it plugged in right now. I unplugged it briefly to go do something with it, but you want to click load from device, which means read the device. You want to make sure you do that before you do any other further steps, so it can show that it's reading the settings that the company optimized for you. And it's also really important too to make sure you use the card, the actual SD card that they gave you, because if you're not a computer nerd, all these devices and cards and programming can get confusing. But it's not just about them optimizing like a motherboard of the Zulu device for you. They're also formatting the card for your sampler ahead of time. So make sure you use the card that they gave you. They gave me a 32 GB SD card, and that's the one that I loaded into the Zulu device, and then I loaded into this program. And by default, it showed 2 GB, but like I said, you're going to change it to 32, and then you'll save it. What I caught, and then I'm going back and fixing right now, before we proceed further in this video, is I don't know if this is actually what fixed my problem, but I was having issues reading the Zulu device onto the SCSI drive of my Roland XV-5080. And I got on the phone with customer service, and we did a lot of troubleshooting. And the one thing that we edited, basically we reread the SD card and rewrote it, and we also changed for device 1, we changed the SCSI ID to 1 instead of 0. And I'm not sure if that is what fixed it, or just by rereading and rewriting the SD card is what fixed it. But make sure, if you're having trouble, try doing that. If it's not working after you're just editing the device size to 32 gigs, try changing the ID to 1 instead of 0. See if that helps. If your device isn't being recognized, another way that you'll know is if you go to try to save any settings here, this load from device and the save to device options will both be grayed out to where you can't click them. But what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to edit only one thing, because like I said, when you buy the Zulu device, the team at Sampler Zone optimizes it for whatever sampler that you specify. So this is already optimized, like data-wise and like architecture-wise, to work best with my Roland XV-5080. But the one thing that they don't do, that they insist that you do, is increase the device size. So what this means is that they've already optimized the actual Zulu device for 32 gigabits, right? Because that's based on the specs of the Roland XV-5080, but we're looking at the actual card size here. So we want to set this 2 gigabyte to 32 gigabytes. And then we will click Save to Device. So looking at this utility program, just to get into a little more detail about it too, since the configuration of the Zulu v6.4 stored on the SD card is stored in a secret area, not as an actual file, it's stored on, and it's not stored on the board itself, it's stored on the SD card, as the secret hidden file. The SD card must be configured using this utility program. The utility program lets you enable the SCSI's IDs, the disk IDs, and set the sector start and sector size for each of these IDs. So that's a lot of nerd shit, but what that basically means is that there's 2 ways you can decide to go about partitioning the data on the SD card. So, by default, you'll have the SCSI terminator enabled. Like all these things are default. The only thing that, like I said, I changed was the card size. But basically, if you wanted to enable multiple device IDs, disk IDs, you would click Enable. And by default, these names are all set to an ID like ID1, ID2, ID3, and so forth. You want to leave everything to the default settings, but you can increase the device size so long as the math works out so that you're not going past the data that's actually available on your SD card. So I don't know what 32 divided by 7 is, but if you have a 32 gigabyte SD card, you could divide it into whatever that number is when you divide it by 7 for each of all 7 of these device IDs. The SD card start sector, like I'm not a computer nerd, so I'm probably going to get like the science about this wrong, but what this enables you to do is you can see it says overlapping data, and that's because we have the sector starting at 0. I guess this is like from 0 to infinity is the number of like where the data is starting on each separate of these disks. So like if I click auto, that means that since I only have 2 of these devices enabled, it's splitting the available data in half, and at that halfway point is where the next device number 2, starts. So that seems like, I don't know how you'd feasibly be able to keep track of like where your files are starting. Like if you have multiple folders from different like artists of samples, you might accidentally like split that same artist folder across 2 different disks because you don't know exactly where the first disk ends and then the next one begins as far as available data. So that's just another reason why you don't want to go this route and just enable the first device only. But like, getting back to that second option of using multiple device IDs, and this is info that I've gleaned from both like the product manuals of the Zulu device, customer service questions, forums, other YouTube videos, the Roland manual. But basically, like you'd want to use the second option of multiple device IDs, for samplers that have a limit to their disk capacity, such as most that use FAT or FAT16. That's FAT. I guess that's some data type of reading category. I'm not sure about that. I'm not a computer nerd, but like, but yeah, like those types of devices that use FAT or FAT16 should be set up with multiple IDs, as that takes full advantage of the large SD card that you'd be using. However, with samplers that use the FAT32, which is what Roland uses, you should just set up one ID, like I said. And that's because the FAT32 manages large disk size extremely efficiently. However, this may not be your preference. So yeah, if you want to split things into 7 sections, one per ID, then knock yourself out. Um, the other reason why you just want to use one in our case is because with the FAT32 data organization system that the Roland uses, I mean, you already have free reign to organize as many samples as you can fit onto that fucking card. You can organize them into as many folders and subfolders as you want, which the Roland XV-5080 will let you menu dive and navigate through the folders, just as you would on a computer. Not all samplers let you do that, I guess, but that's why having multiple disk IDs would be redundant. Because, and like I said, by using this utility program and changing the SD card size from 2 to the full 32 gigabits of the card, that allows you to have as many folders as will fit onto it. So sorry that was really long-winded, but we needed to iron that out. So okay, so now you want to plug in the DB25 cable into the back, and then connect that cable to the SCSI port in the back of the Roland XV-5080, right? Okay, now you'll turn the power on after you plugged in that, and that's important. You want to make sure that that's all plugged in first. I'll turn on. So one thing to note before you proceed to turn on the Roland is that if you're using the card that that sampler zone or Chicken Systems or Zulu, they're all like kind of the same company. If you're using the card that they sent you, then they should have already formatted it for whatever sampler that you told them you want, right? So they already formatted this for the Roland XV-5080, and when I talk to customer service, they say don't reformat it don't waste your time formatting it on the Roland through the Roland's actual formatting menu diving. Just boot it right up. Now, if you were using your own card that they did not give you, then before you use the utility program or boot it or load any samples onto it, you would want to format that card on the actual Roland or whatever sampler you're using, right? And it's going to delete any files that you've thrown onto that SD card when you reformat it. So that's why you want to do that first if you're using some card that they didn't give you. Turn on the power. And now it's important to watch the bottom right of this window as this thing boots up, because it'll show you it reading the available disks. And so it's scanning the SCSI devices. So there's nothing in slot 1 for ID 0, because remember we changed the ID to ID 1 instead of ID 0. If we called it ID 0, it would show up there for that first option. But see, look, it's like scanning that second slot, and it should show HD there. Might take a while, so hold on. So it didn't show anything there, so that, and it's taking way longer than it should too. So that's how you know something's fucked up. So we might need to do some more troubleshooting here. Yeah, because it's going to scan through all the rest of these, and it's going to take like 10 minutes, and it's just going to show blank signs for all of them. So, okay, so we're going to try again, because it seems that randomly it'll work and randomly it won't work. So let's see. We're going to watch the boot screen, and it should quickly scan our drives. See, look how quick that was. It shows HD right there in slot 2 for ID 1, as it should, and it booted up really quickly as it should. So it's worked more often than not. I'm not sure why it fucked up in that last example, but let's test to make sure it's reading the actual SCSI drive, right? So, and drive is the word I should have used instead of disks. There's a lot of like computer hackery nomenclature going on here between this actual Roland sampler, the fucking computer over here, the Zulu instructions, but in the terms of the Roland sampler, it's able to read up to 7 drives. And now we're wanting to, we're going to want to load the SCSI drive, and it just gave us that error that you saw, improper disk, because the first thing it looks at is what's in your memory card slot, because you can choose between your SCSI drives that you hook up to it, or you can choose between what you put on this old school smart media card, which is not the same thing as an SD card that you shove into the memory card slot. And by default, the Roland tries to display that first, and I have a fucked up memory card, so that's why it just flashed that message at us, improper card. Don't let that scare you off. Keep proceeding, because like I said, it's not looking at the SCSI shit. yet. It's not looking at the Zulu, which is plugged into the SCSI. It's only looking at that card first because we haven't told it to look at the SCSI yet. So we're going to click Drive to show our drives that we want it to look at. So give it a second. Jesus Christ. Yeah, so it showed in proper disk again because, again, it's looking at your first option, which is the memory card slot, and I have a fucked up memory card. But don't let that scare you. Proceed yet again. Use the wheel to select. See, it's showing the SCSI. That is the name of the SD card right there. So it's actually reading the card. So we're going to click OK. And cool. So on that card, I loaded a sample folder called Dopeds, right? And so it's showing that folder, and within that folder I have some subfolders. So yeah, there's 2 subfolders there, 1 and 2. We'll select 1, and that's all the WAV files that I loaded into that subfolder. So that's great. So it's properly reading our files. And it's worth mentioning that if you're only seeing, if you go back and you're only seeing, we're not there right now on the screen, but like when you go to select your fucking SCSI device, like if it doesn't show the name of the SD card in there and it's just blank, then that means that something's fucked up. So the best thing to do is to, connect to the USB-C again to the Zulu device and use the utility program again to load/write the SD card and then resave it /rewrite it and then eject it again and then try booting it up with the Roland again. Now we are at the point where we can select our samples that we want to load. So if I just want to select one sample that I have highlighted there, that first one, track 1, I would click Mark, F5, to mark it, and then I click Select. And I can already tell you what's going to happen. I'm still waiting for them to come in the mail, but when I bought this thing on eBay, I guess it either has no memory cards or fucked up memory cards loaded into the top of it, because you can't see it now because I have all this shit on top of the Roland, but there's a panel that you unscrew on the top of it, and that's how you load the SIMM memory boards. They're these big, fat, wide, like motherboards that hold the memory of this thing. And from what I read, from digging around on forums and like combing through the manual, they don't really emphasize this, but if you don't have any memory, or if you don't have a SIM card, if you don't have the motherboards inserted into this thing, here where it says SIM, it'll just have a slash mark. It won't display any data. But if you have a fucked up card, or no memory left, it'll say 0 bytes. It should display, if you have a card in here, how much data you have left on it. And from like digging around on forums and whatever, I found that you can have plenty of memory on your memory card that you insert here, which is an external card. You can have plenty of memory on the SD card from your Zulu device or whatever. But internally, if this thing doesn't have memory, internally on this SIMM card, it won't load your samples. It's not like it's just using external memory from your external devices to load the samples. It has to like route them internally into here, as part of like the middleman process of whatever, right? So if we go to select this track, what's going to happen is it's going to say memory error because I either have a fucked up motherboard or I have no memory left on it. So I'm waiting for those cards to arrive in the mail, and I'm going to swap them out, and I'm going to let you know if that fixes it. Also going to get a different memory card. This memory card is one that I bought on eBay as well. And it's an old school smart media card, and it's 128 megabytes, and I think that's the problem. I think I need to use a 32 megabyte one, because that's like what this thing is spec'd out for. I think that was the biggest size you could get at the time. So even though it's the same type of card, like technologically, and it might be formatted the same, I think maybe you just need to use a regular 32 gig one. So I also bought that, and when that arrives, I will let you know if that fixes it. If it does fix it, we shouldn't be getting that improper disk error whenever we try to load the memory card. So okay, so it's a couple days later, and both the 2 SIM cards arrived, and I put them in, and I'll show you what it looks like when you open the top panel, like where they go. So these 2 slots here, A and B, there was nothing in them. And the manual says that if you don't have any SIM cards, then the display will just have a slash mark through it and won't display any capacity of data, like 0 or whatever. But for whatever reason, it was telling me I had 0 kilobytes. So that made me assume that there were cards in here, but that they were maybe like broken or fucked up. But yeah, there were none to begin with. So I bought new ones and I put them in. And if you want to know how to do that, they go over it pretty well in the manual. So I won't waste your time with that. But yeah, and another thing we can do to just prove that that fixed it is, there's two quick ways to look. So if you go to System and you go to Info, this will show you over here, SIMM. Yeah, we've got each of those cards has 64 megabytes on it, so that's a total of 128 megabytes. And then we can see the same thing by going over to disk. And yeah, it doesn't say 0 anymore, so that fixed that. And the new card that I got also worked. So it turns out that the guy sold me a fucked up card originally. So I just got a generic 32 megabyte one, smart media card, and now it's not giving me the improper disk error anymore. I'll show you. So we'll go to disk. Another thing you want to do is and the thing was, it wouldn't even let me format the fucked up card. But this card, the first thing I did before I started doing anything else is I formatted it on this machine. So, you would click F5 for tool, then you would go to format. Oh, Jesus. Yeah, so, okay, what was I saying? Yeah, so it got done loading. So what it'll make you do is if you try to format it right now by pressing F5 for full, is it'll give you an error, even with this new working card, saying like that the volume label, volume name is improper or whatever, and that's just because it has a generic name of 32 megabyte or whatever. And this machine has decided that it doesn't read that name, that makes you name it something. So I just named it patches because that's what I'm going to use the smart media card for, is storing patches. And I'm going to use the SCSI Drive, the Zulu, for the SD card inside of that for storing samples. So yeah, I got samples on the SD card and patches on the smart media card. That's like what I'm trying to do. So yeah, you'll format it, click OK. And yeah, you can see it works like a charm. It wasn't working before, but now it does. So the other thing that putting in the memory cards fixed is now I'm able to use the SD card, so via the SCSI drive. So if we go back to disk, go to load, and we'll click drive again to select the drive we want to load, and we'll select the SCSI drive. We'll click OK. And cool, that's the name of the sample CD was Dope Heads that I loaded onto the SD card. So it's cool, we can see that now. If you're not seeing anything, then something's fucked up, like I said. So we can navigate. You just press the right arrow like it's prompting you to go to the folder that you want. I've got subfolders within subfolders, right? Cool, now here's our WAV files. So before it wasn't letting me select them because I didn't have memory, but now it will. It didn't give me an error message and it's letting me load them. And I'm not going to get into how to do that yet, but we know that everything's working just fine now. So okay, so now I'm going to talk to you about how to translate weird types of sample formats into formats that your sampler can actually read. So in the case of the Roland XV-5080, it can read different types of files like waves and whatnot, but there's certain files that it cannot read. And basically, if you in the modern days that we live in, where we're not perhaps using certain types of SCSI drives that will just rip these CDs, you're probably trying to do this maybe on your computer or what have you, or maybe you just have the files already and need to translate them. But in any case, like on my desktop, my tower computer here, with its fucking CD drive, it's able to rip CDs that have WAV files and other types of common formats. But like if I try to rip this CD right here, it's all the tracks on this CD are in the Akai and E-MU format. And that's like a format that like you would shove this disk inside like an Akai sampler that has a disk drive on it, and it would read those. But my fucking computer over here won't show anything on this disk once I insert it. It'll be fucking blank. So that's where the software called Translator 7 comes in handy. So this is a software that you can choose to buy. If not, maybe there's another workaround. But this is made by the same company called Chicken Systems that made the Zulu drive. So I guess just to clear things up, Chicken Systems is like the company that engineers and designs, the Zulu drive and the software, and Sampler Zone, I guess, is their fucking storefront, right? But in any case, yeah, if you buy the software and install it, you'll be able to translate files. One thing about this software is that when you install it, it's going to also make you install another type of software called iLock License Manager. So it's free. Just go ahead and do that, and it'll make you create like a login ID and all that. Just do all that shit, and then when you want to run the program, just run as administrator. So I have it opened right here, and we'll go through what you do in this program. Another thing too is if we try to open this program and it gives you like an error message saying that translator 7 may have stalled out, would you like to enable or disable sound in the program? In my case, I had to disable sound, which is fine because I'm not needing to listen to shit in here. I'm just trying to rip CDs that are in weird formats and translate them. I don't need to hear anything. So just disable the sound, and that fixed it. I was able to open the program. Okay, so in translator 7, over here on the left, we have all of our available drives that are being read on our computer. So whether that's our disk drive or our fucking hard drive or whatever USB drives you might have plugged in, yada, 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 right? So let's try to convert this Akai formatted sample CD that, like before, I told you my computer can't read let's see if we can convert it. So we'll go over here and we have to click refresh. So just wait like 5 seconds for the computer to warm up the fucking CD, right? Okay, refresh. Okay, so something that we see now, we don't see my CD-ROM drive is drive H, and here's the important thing to point out is that it's not going to show the thing in here, but over here in proprietary devices, now we see this new proprietary fucking drive that appeared. And lo and behold, this is our Akai shit, right? So voila, we can see it now. If you really want to see what all this Translator 7 software can do, there's videos made by Chicken Systems and other end users that really show the full potential of this great software. I'm not here to do that. I'm here to just show you how to get this shit onto this shit, okay? Okay, so let's convert the CD. So since I'm dealing with a physical CD that my normal computer can't read, and what we want to do here, since we're not working with just like a folder full of digital files that we downloaded from the internet or ripped off a USB drive, and we're dealing with this funky formatted Akai like disk, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to click on proprietary devices so that we can see Akai CD, and we're going to right click, and we want to create a virtual drive. I'm going to, in layman's terms, my computer nerds might smack me on the head and tell me like I'm explaining this wrong, but for practical reasons, what a virtual drive is we're just creating like a digital version of the CD, so that we're copying the shit from the CD into a virtual version of it, so that we can start tampering with it and not be affecting the actual physical disk. So you want to create virtual drive, and sorry to interrupt myself and interrupt the video here, but just I'm reading the Sound on Sound article, and it says, let's be clear about this. The XV-5080 is not a sampler. Like the Roland SP700, it's a sample playback machine capable of loading and using Roland S770, S750, and S760 data. However, unlike the previous Roland P, the XV will also load Akai data, waves, and AIFF files. So I'm not really sure what to make of that as far as what I need to do next for you people watching this, but as far as whether or not I need to convert, if I can just leave the files that are on the partition to CD as they are in that Akai format. But I'm just going to pretend that I want to convert all that shit into WAV files, right? Whatever format I end up choosing to convert that virtual drive to, if I even need to convert it, it's in Akai format, so allegedly maybe it'll work, but I guess I'm going to make that virtual drive like a Roland format. The options that it gives you in Translator 7 are, if we right click and create virtual drive, these are all the different options you get for the format, and some of these, according to that Sound on Sound article, will work on the XV-5080. I'm not sure how many of them will, but I do know that according to that article, the 770 and 760, the S770, all that shit that I just told you, is going to work. So let's just do that for the sake of simplicity. Bear in mind, like the big picture of what I'm trying to do right now with Chicken Systems and the CD is I'm trying, like I said before, I want the Zulu SD card reader device that acts as the SCSI drive on the Roland. I want samples to be on the SD card, and I want patches to be on the Smart Media card right there. That's the goal of what I'm doing with all this shit, right? So moral of the story is I need the samples from this Akai disk to be in a format, in a part, these partitions to go onto the SD card that will be read by the Zulu device. So that's what I'm trying to accomplish. Okay, so yeah, right click, create virtual drive. It'll ask us if you want to create an entire physical drive, copy a formatted part of the drive or do some other shit. Let's try copy the entire physical drive. And now it'll ask you where to create the virtual drive. So I'm just going to create the virtual drive on, I'm going to see if I can do something clever. And this is my actual SD card that I'm reading from the Zulu device, right? I'm going to see if I can just throw this partitioned series of folders on the SD card as they are. And so that my Roland can read the SCSI drive with the SD card and navigate through the folders as they appear how they're supposed to. Sorry if that sounded confusing, but yeah, let's go ahead and create a new folder. Well, actually, we got to be careful here. Oh, I just caught something. So this is a .img file. So that's an image file. And as far as I know, the Roland XV-5080 does not read image files or ISO files like other samplers may. So hold on a sec. Let's do, yeah, see, you can save as ISO or image. So hold on a sec. So I decided to save it as the image file and on my desktop instead of the SD card. So looks like it's going to take like 2 hours or some shit to do this. So if that was just like a wrong tangent to go down, but that's happening in the background right now. But let's get back to focusing on a more practical thing here. So let's go back to our main window on the left over here. And let's, rather than trying to create a virtual drive, maybe another good way to go about this is to just rather than right clicking, we're gonna regular click the Akai CD. Okay, so double click it and wait a second, and cool. So this is the conversion translator window that pops up when you click it normally instead of right click, right? So let's there's program folder, then the sample folder. So it's a little confusing because if you click the drop down, it just shows like a couple of little things. But I figured out, I think set, I guess, is the equivalent of browse, right? So let's browse to set our program folder onto our SD drive directly. So I created this folder called Dance Mega Jungle Rave because that's what the CD is called. So select sample folder. Let's set that to. And I guess, I don't know if I'm being redundant and stupid and retarded here, but let's just create a folder within that. Called that folder Dance Mega Jungle Rave. So yeah. Okay. So now we will proceed to the next step. So while we have this whole window open, let's kind of take a look at if we were to click options, let's see what happens. So like I said, I'm not going to dive into every feature of this fucking thing, but one interesting thing that I noticed is it has, since I bought this as a package with the Zulu drive from Sampler Zone, I don't know if they would do this by default, whether you buy it as a package or not, but it's nice to know that they've checked this box that says check for ZuluSCSI SD cards. So, but yeah, I guess you can just kind of specify how you want this thing to work with, you know, some shit. I don't fucking know, people. But moving on, let's go down to here. It says format type. So this confused me at first because I thought these were all the different things it was recognizing on the CD. But what's good is you can select what type of sampler you're working with. These are different types of samplers that it's giving you the option of choosing, because the people at Chicken Systems worked really hard to like try to acquire every single type of sampler they could think of and make the software work with it, right? So in our case, we have a hardware sampler. We have the Roland XV-5080. So cool, we can see that it's there. So let's try this. Let's try using the SV5080 patch and clicking OK. Please input name of the physical drive or virtual drive. Hold on a sec. Named it Jungle Rave. Okay. So then, and I clicked OK. Now this window popped up. So translating Akai volume to Roland XV-5080 bank. Okay, that sounds good. So let's partition A. Okay, no, oh, so it's doing this shit right in front of my eyes. Okay. Okay, cool. So I think this is good. It's going through each partition one by one and translating it to a Roland bank. So if this is going to have any hiccups, which it appears it might be having a hiccup right now, maybe that's because I improperly named those folders within folders. I might have fucked up there. Let's see what happens. So I'm going to pause until this gets close to being finished, and then I'll resume. That, and now this window says, yeah, finished translating Akai CD into Roland XV-5080 bank format. You can find the new files at drive g/dance mega jungle rave. So let's click open and closing folder. And yeah, we can see that drive G, which is the SD card, now has this. Okay, so I figured out what was wrong. So I don't know if this fixed it, but what I made sure I did this time around is in the translator window here, I just made sure the program folder was set to G, which is my SD card, and I did not set a sample folder. I just kept it simple. I think that maybe me creating folders within folders and doing all that like fucked up the format when this thing is already trying to do the legwork of formatting everything for the Roland XV-5080 patch format. So, what it did differently this time is if I go and look at the contents of my SD card, and I look at the partitions and I open them, now I'm starting to see SVDs, which is that file type that is read by the Roland. And none of these contents were inside of the partitions before when I did it the last time without when I tried to create a bunch of subfolders. Okay, so let's test if it works this time. So I'm back in the disk menu. We're going to load, and we're going to select drive and make sure we select the SCSI drive. Okay, so this is the Jungle Ray folder. Those are partitions. Those are our volumes, and this is. So if I go into the sample folder, these are all individual WAV files. Now let's go back, and then we can select the SVD. So I'm going to dive deeper into this and let you know what's going on here, but I think that this SVD contains all of those samples, whereas if I go into the sample folder, I can select individual samples. So let's select the SVD. We'll mark it with F5, or sorry, F6 I mean, and then we'll mark it with F5, select it with F6, and we'll load it with F6. It's asking to overwrite the following user data. Are you sure? And okay, yeah, so it's talking about overwriting performance user 1 through 64, patch 1 through 128, and rhythm 1 through 04. So that is a full setup that it's asking us to overwrite, not just one patch or one performance or one rhythm. It's a full setup, which includes a full bank of patches, a full bank of performances, and a full bank of rhythm kits. That's what I'm interpreting. So we'll click OK. And it's also asking us that the partials or samples on the SIMM will be discarded. So we're going to click OK and processing. Wait for that shit to get done loading. Okay, now let's exit disk mode. Okay, cool. So it loaded the actual track as it appears in the CD booklet. So 140 BPM, number 1. Cool. So those are our beat loops. That's pretty fucking cool. So each of these keys is assigned a different loop. As I showed you earlier, when we viewed in the translator, all these different samples were assigned to different keys. And what I'm assuming is that each of these samples that are assigned to these different keys are those different WAV files that we were seeing as they appeared as individual samples in that folder that was called samples. So in my opinion, the best thing to do is to ignore the sample folder and instead load the SVD folder or the SVD file, which, like I said, is a full setup. And that full setup spreads all the samples across the keys. Let's see what happens when we go to, we're in user patches right now. Let's see what happens when we select patch number 2. Okay, so that kind of makes sense. What it did is it erased all of the other patches in the library, and because it basically compressed all the loadouts for each key on the keyboard into just one patch. So okay, so now let's assume for whatever reason you want to delete patches from the SIMM. If we look over here in our disk menu, we can see that our SIMM is 120 megabytes instead of the original 128, because us loading that Swan sample SVD used a whole 8 megabytes. So let's go to utility, press that twice, and we'll go to F4, delete. And this is the tricky part, is we're in performance mode, so we're just seeing all of our blank fucking performances that replaced all of the ones that were there before. Because what we did is we loaded a whole SVD file, which is a whole setup, which replaces patches, performances, and rhythm kits. So let's scroll up here to, we can choose to delete all this shit if we want by marking all of it and deleting it, but just to show you what's going on, let's press the up arrow to highlight performance, and now let's select patch. And there you can see, voila, is that 140 beats per minute sample that we loaded. So we can mark that and delete it if we want. So I'm just showing you that that is an option. But getting back to that issue that we're facing, where if I am trying to load the sample here, you know, like I'm in partition 1, volume 1, and this is our sample, our SVD. I failed to mention before that if you press the right arrow again, you can also open that SVD and look at individual performances and patches. So if we want to select a patch, which is a key layout of all those different drum loops that I showed you, we can see that this first sample has the patch called 140 BPM number 1. So we'll mark that with F5, and we'll select just that one, and we'll load just that one. And let's refresh. Hold on a sec. Okay, I stumbled earlier. Yeah, so yeah, you'll select load for the patch. And now you can decide to just, rather than replacing a whole user bank of patches, rather than like replacing all of those with just one patch from the sample and the rest being initialized patches, we can maximize our use of memory by just replacing things patch by patch, rather than replacing a whole SVD with another whole SVD. So let's expand on that idea. So we're going to select what patch we want to replace. So let's try replacing patch number 2, which is this initialized patch. And if things work out, then we'll have both of these as user bank number 1 and user bank's patch number 1 and user bank patch number 2. Let's see what happens. Okay, so it completed loading. So let's refresh. So yeah, this is our first patch. Okay, cool. So I'm seeing both sampler loop keyboard loadouts. So these are 2 different patches. So that's great. So we found a workaround that also might be tedious, because you're going to have to individually select patches that you want to load and replace whatever individual pre-existing user patches, like one by one. You're replacing user bank patches with sample library patches one by one in this way. But in this, which is very tedious, but it beats loading one sample from your volume of a partition. It beats having to do this. If I am in partition A, volume 1, and I want sample 1, sample set 1, which is basically a patch, which has a drum loop assigned to each of these keys. What happens if you try to load that whole SVD file is all it does is it only replaces one of the user bank patches with this first one that you selected, but all the rest of those fucking patches are just blank initialized init patches. So that's a big fucking waste of memory. So the smart thing to do is, when you're in disk mode, to select each of these as patches, not SVDs. You know, you press the right arrow key when you see the SVD on the Roland, and you just select the patch, not performance or rhythm. You select the patch, and then you replace user 1 with volume 1 dash patch 1. You replace user patch number 2 with volume 1 patch number 2. You replace user 3 with volume 1 patch 3. You get the idea? That's the best way to maximize your memory, of your SIMM memory. That way you don't have to reload a whole fucking SVD every time you want to go to a different sample loadout, a different patch from your sample CD. So what I explained sounds very tedious, because think about how long it's going to take to go through each volume from this disk, and within each volume, you're selecting a patch to replace every single user patch with. That sounds really fucking tedious to do on the Roland. So let's experiment and try to think of a way faster way to do that. And that way is going to be to use that program I showed you earlier called XV Librarian. So let's try loading all the SVDs that are on this disk, aka our SD card, into the fucking XV Librarian software, and creating a whole user bank of 128 patches, where each of those patches are a patch from each of these SVDs. Not a WAV file, but a patch. To reiterate what I mean, go to load, show you the architecture of the folders. So that's our SD card, our jungle rave folder. Those are our partitions: partition 1, volume 1, volume 2, volume 3. So let's click volume 1. That's an SVD. That's what we don't want. We want to click right arrow, go to patch. And there's only one patch in that. If we go back, we'll go to volume 2. We're still in partition 1, but we're in volume 2. Patch. Okay, that's patch number 2. So those are all patches. We want to load those all in a way so that we have 128 of these, all in the same sequential order that you see on the fucking liner notes of this CD. We're going to do that in XV Librarian, so that way we can create a user bank that has all 128 patches, and each of those patches a sample loadout, where each of these keys plays a full drum loop. I know that I sound really fucking long-winded, but like, this shit is so meticulous, and I want to be clear about what I'm saying. Okay, so I have SV Librarian opened, the program that I showed you earlier. God, this fucking camera. Okay. So yeah, when you open the program by default, it opens up just a blank SVD, a blank setup with 128 blank patches, right? So right now I have my computer reading the SD card, which contains the samples from this disk right here, the Jungle Rave disk. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to File, Open SVD File, and just to show you how I got here, this is my fucking SD card. Yep, the Jungle Rave folder, partition A, volume 1, and then yeah, we're seeing there's our sample folder that has all of our waves. If we open that, we're not going to see shit because it's looking for an SVD file, not wave files. So let's go back and let's load this SVD, which loads an entire user bank with wasted space for patches 2 through 200, or patches 2 through 128, and patch number 1 being the only patch that has any data. What a fucking waste, right? So like I said, what we're going to do is we're going to create a whole SVD, a new one, to load onto the Roland, or I should say to load onto the SD card, where this SVD is going to contain 128 patches, where each patch is a sample loadout. Each patch is one of these sample loop loadouts. So all we do is just do Control-C, copy, or you can click Edit and copy, the slow way. So Control-C. And let's go over to our new SVD that we're going to create. Control-V. There we go. So this is going to be tedious, but this might be worth it to you if you want to have a whole user bank where each patch is a simple loadout. Think about it too. This might be a waste of your time, or it might be a great thing for you to do. It might be a waste of your time if your workflow for creating and recording music is that you already know that when you're making a song, you've already done some meditation. You've already thought that, okay, I already know what the song needs, and it just needs me to have a loadout where each of these sample loops is going to satisfy what I need. I don't need to have each patch be its own sample loadout with a bunch of different genres and BPMs. If I'm working on one song at a time, I've already done the meditation and pre-thinking to know which sample set I want, and that's good enough for me to just load a whole SVD where that's the only patch that I can pick from, and the rest are blank initialized patches. that are wasted space. But maybe that doesn't matter for me because, like I said, I'm recording this one song at a time, and I just need to load from disk once and just be able to have all of these keys be different drum loops of that one genre, of that one BPM. Um, you know what I mean? Like going through the tedious like if you're only working on one song at a time, where you're only going to be needing like a similarity of different drum loops for each of these keys, it might be a fucking waste of your time to go through and create this whole library of loading SVDs one at a time from the SD card and making them all patches in this new SVD that you're creating. You know what I mean? That's because that's already going to take forever. Um, that's already a sacrifice. Where the benefit is creating a new user bank where we can just select new sample loadouts quickly. But like I said, if you're working on one song at a time where you already have an idea of what drum sample set you want to use, aka what one of these patches you want to use, then you're only going to need to load from disk and replace your user bank with just that one patch once. You know what I mean? When you're doing multi-track recording, you just record all of your drums in one session, and then you just can delete all that shit by replacing it with whatever regular synthesizer patches you want to load out. You know what I mean? I'm thinking what I'm going to do though, even with those pros and cons that I just described, I think in this specific scenario, I have 3 of these dance mega discs, right? And each of them have less than 128 patches on them. So where each patch is a sample loadout, where each of these keys is a different drum loop, aka a different wave file. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to create an SVD for each of these discs. So in this, coincidentally, luck has it that like this disc, by the time you get to the final partition G, you're at patch number 64. Like the nomenclature doesn't call this patches like we've gone through, but like it's going to appear as patch number 64 if you're copying and pasting every single patch from this disk into your new SVD loadout. So that means that what I could theoretically do is have my SD card have if I'm putting 3 of these CDs onto my SD card, then my SD card will just have 3 SVDs, where each SVD is one of these CDs. And like, let's take a look at this other disc. Dance Mega House Dance. All right. So let's pull out the fucking booklet. Okay. So we can see that there is a grand total of there's a grand total of 79 what will be patches when we run it through this process, or actually when we run it through the translator 7 process. Keep in mind, before I can start fucking with this disk and making it an SVD file, first I have to make it an SVD file before I can load it into XV Librarian and make a new SVD. That sounds so confusing, but like what I showed you before is I have to use translator 7, that software, to convert this disk into a Roland XV-5080 formatted folder that will go on the SD card. And then after I do that, then I'll run it through this process of continuing what I was saying. So now I showed you how to do that first one. So real quickly, we'll open SVD file again, and this time we'll go back to partition A, and we'll select sample number 2 this time. And, Control C, we'll go to preset number 2 in our new user bank, Control V, and so forth. You'll just repeat that 126 times until you get to patch number 128, and that's going to take probably like a fucking hour. And like I said, that might save you time if you want to have instant access to different patches, where each patch is a sample loadout. But the other reason why this might not help you is it's kind of redundant and kind of a waste of time too, because like all of these individual patches from the sample disk, all these sample loadouts, are organized in partitions and volumes already. And if you're loading them into a user bank with 128 patches, they're that whole method of organization is not the same as this anymore. Now you just have all of these in chronological order, and 128 of them, but no actual subfolders within subfolders like this is set up as. And this disk might have 190 patches on it, right? And that's going to be really confusing when you've created 128 of these and then you want to load the 129th one, which just randomly might be volume 55 rave synth 5, and you have to load a complete new user, or you have to load a complete new SVD and erase all of your shit of user patches 1 through 128 from this first one that we created. You know what I mean? Like, that's going to be, when you get to that point, then this shit all of a sudden becomes real confusing with the nomenclature. So I'm giving you just these perspectives as kind of like forewarnings. But if you have maybe like a new legend that you create, rather than referring to this at all, that helps you kind of organize these to match having multiple 128 patch user sample banks, and you don't look at this shit at all or think of this shit at all, and you have your new legend, maybe that's relabeled somewhere else, then maybe this will help you a lot. Okay, so this time I've gone through all that labor to make every single patch correspond to every single sample set by making all the SVDs, which only contain one sample set, aka one patch, by taking every single one of them and pulling them into one SVD. So now, yeah, as you can see, as I scroll through, it's just going down the list of all of them. But I'm having a big problem now. So all that work was for nothing, and I've just realized why. There's no sound coming out, and the reason why is because I don't have any of the waveforms in the sample folder anymore. I'll show you what I mean by that. If I go to disk, go to load, all I have are these patches now that are, I don't have those sample folders anymore that contain the waveforms. So this the Roland now has nothing to go off of. It doesn't actually have those waveforms. I was mistaken. I just assumed that the SVD file that I created and the XV librarian or translator, the XV librarian was going to like contain the waveforms, but that's not the case at all. You still have to have those waveforms, those sample loops, in their own formatted like folder that's formatted to the Roland XV-5080. So unfortunately, we can only load one sample pack at a time as one whole SVD. So that fucking sucks. But because the only way that you'd be able to work around that would be if you had one giant folder, I guess, that was for like, and even then it might not work, but like, that wouldn't work because, I was going to say maybe you could have one giant fucking folder that has every single sample, but I think all those samples are named like sample 1 through 12 for patch 1, and then patch 2 is also sample 1 through 12. Patch 3 is also sample 1 through 12. So you have to like rename all those samples so that they would correspond properly. You know what I mean? It's complicated, but I guess the answer is, unfortunately, we have to only use the format that we did in Translator 7, and that we can't bypass that by reformatting everything into bulk SVDs with the XV librarian. So that sucks. Yeah, in summary, all you need to do, all you can do, is use Translator 7 to format your sample disks into the Roland XV-5080 patch format, and then your folder architecture. What I did here, just so you know, is I have 2 master folders that have everything else inside of them that I was formatted with Translator 7. So I just divided the shit into 2 types of things: loops, which are sample like drum loops or beat loops or whatever that play back when you press a key, and then waves, which are wave files that those samples are dependent on, or waveforms that you can assign to a key when you create a patch. These are patches. Loops are basically patches, and then waves are not patches. They're just waveforms that I can use to create patches. So I hope that clears things up. But getting back to what I was talking about, each of these is a sample disk that I translated. So look at this one, dope heads. Yep, partition A, all your volumes within that partition. And then, yeah, you have to have a sample folder that this patch, the SVD, can feed off of. So unfortunately, you have to load each of these patches one by one. And when you do that, you can only use one sample keyboard loadout patch, and then the rest of them are blank patches in your user bank. So that sucks. But like I said, hopefully you're going into making music with a mindset where you already know which keyboard loadout of samples you want to use. And I guess in theory, you could create your own patch that feeds off of more than just the samples in this folder and has more than just this patch. But that also sounds like a fucking nightmare too. But it'd be a fucking nightmare that you'd only have to do once, I guess, right? So. Okay, so a sample loop is assigned to each of these keys, right? So if I press a key once, it plays the whole loop. So now let's think about what do we do about that if we want to have me be locked tightly in time with a master tempo, so that I don't have to perfectly time my pressing of the key in order to, you know, I don't want to have to like time me using my finger to press this key perfectly in order to like record 10 bars of this drum beat. What I would want to do is program the sequencer to play these beats in a quantized mode so that everything is aligned in tempo and I don't have to be pressing these keys manually. So what will happen is if so all of these sample loops are idealized by the person who created them to fit within a certain BPM. So what that means is if you set your master clock tempo, if you have a MIDI clock coming into the Roland XV-5080, if you have it set to 140 beats per minute instead of, say, 100 beats per minute, then that means that, in theory, if you have a sequencer playing, let's say, for example, this note C, repeatedly, that's your sequence is C, 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 C. Then if your master tempo is 140 beats per minute, then there shouldn't be any overlapping of the loop. It should just start and reset in time with itself so that it's not overlapping itself. It'll be in time, you know what I mean? So what I ran into, and I guess this is really dependent on your setup. Like in my case, my MIDI keyboard that I'm using is an Arteria key step. And when you have it set to MIDI mode, where it receives a master clock and then transmits it through its output into my Roland. So it's passing along MIDI clock data, and you can set the rate of time division to be quarter notes, eighth notes, and 16th notes, right? And even 32nd notes. The problem with that is there's not half notes or whole notes. So what that means, what I found out, is that if I set my master clock to 140 beats per minute, it's going to be resetting this loop way too fast because the rate is not set to whole notes. These loops are treated as whole notes, right? So what that means you have to do is, if quarter notes is the lowest rate that I can set this, like, and my master clock is set to 140 beats per minute, let's just go ahead and do that to show you what happens. So if we hit, I've already programmed my sequence to be a G note and an F note. Those are two different drum beats. So it's like an A-B pattern. Watch what happens. So this is what this one sounds like. So that's what they sound like as whole loops that aren't interrupted by anything. Now, watch what happens if I have it set to the appropriate 140 beats per minute, and I have the lowest time division possible, which is quarter note. See, that's all fucked up. it's like interrupting itself because it's playing these notes too fast. The sequencer is playing them too fast because there's not an option to do whole notes. So what that means is you have to do the math, or I have to do the math because this is my setup. To if I were to slice this in half, then that would be like pretending this sequence to be read as half notes instead of quarter notes. So half of 140 is 75. So watch what happens when I set the master clock to 75. It's still interrupting itself. It's still fucked up because we're doing half notes. We have to treat this as whole notes. So, or sorry, I meant 70, not 75, but it would still be fucked up. The math would still work out to be half notes and not whole notes. So what's a half of 70? 35 beats per minute. So in theory, if I have my master clock set at 35 beats per minute, then it's going to be treating it's going to be sending out whole notes of a loop of 140 beats per minute, because 35 is a fourth of 140. I know this is all fucking confusing, but this is what I have to do. So cool, that's in time. Another way to think about this is, rather than having the key step in sequencer mode, let's switch it to arpeggio mode. And what that means is that you can freehand kind of direct what you want your next drum beat, your next drum loop to go during playback. So you get the idea. And another thing that I noticed about this, which makes sense, is since the Roland XV-5080 is not a sampler, but it's a sample playback machine, that means that whatever MIDI functions are also being force-fed into it during playback are going to affect the sample loops that are being played. So velocity from a MIDI keyboard is a factor. So if I press this softly, it's barely audible. Press it hard, it's loud. So the same thing with the mod and pitch wheels. I guess that affects tempo. I'm not sure what that's all about. But, you get the idea, and you can apply effects in the way that you apply effects to patches on this thing to your sample loops. I'm not going to get into that. Like I said, I'm just showing you how to successfully load samples and play them back on this thing. But so I've loaded up this drum sample patch, or a keyboard loadout. That's 120 beats per minute. So that means we need to set our master clock. Remember, if we're at quarter note divisions on the key step, and these were programmed by the manufacturer as whole note samples, we need to do a quarter of that to get to a whole note BPM. So a quarter of 120 is 30. So if we have our sequence now, which I've programmed a sequence that just plays C, 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 and it's only one note. The sequence is just the note C, and then it repeats. It's not that there's like 5 C's within the sequence. That wouldn't matter because it would just reset, but you know what I'm saying. So that's what's good about this setup, if you're faced with this, is that having a key step, and I think most sequencer style keyboards means that if I press play, it's playing C, but I can transpose that C in real time to a different note on the keyboard, which will trigger a different sample. And the settings that I have formatted on this Arteria key step are that it will finish playing whatever note it's playing in the sequence before playing the next one that you trigger. See what I mean? So that's cool. So like if you know one of these keys is like a drum fill, you know, you could play a regular beat, wait 3 bars, and then here comes the fill. See what I mean? Another kind of thing that you could do to kind of mimic what they do in like trance and shit like that is you can move the rate knob up a rate each pass of the sample loop. See what I mean? The ideal thing that I would have set up with this, instead of having to go over to my master clock and set that to a tempo that does not match 120 beats per minute or whatever the sample is ideally programmed for, instead of having to do that, ideally what I need to do is acquire a MIDI divider device. And these things do exist. There's not a lot of them out there, and they're expensive, but like there's these devices that act as a middleman between your master clock and your receiving device. And what they do is they have a dial or a button on them that allows you to divide the time in even numbers. So you can divide whatever tempo you have set on your master clock in half. You can divide it by 4. You can divide it by 6. You can divide it by 8. So that you can really slow down your tempo. Like your clock is still sending out, let's say 120 beats per minute. But like if you like have your divider device in between set to 1/4, then it's going to do 1/4 of 120 beats per minute. So that means that in theory, you could have that device in between only one of your receiving like hardware synthesizers, and then the rest of them that are receiving that same MIDI clock would still be 120, but the one that's receiving from just the device would be pretending that it's slicing it into quarters and only receiving 30 beats per minute. You know what I'm saying? That would be a helpful setup if you have multiple instruments being recorded at the same time and you need the rest of them to be at 120 and only one of them, in this case my sampler, sample playback machine. Like I said, this is not a sampler. If you only need one of those devices to be pretending that it's following a different tempo, that's where that would be a useful device to hunt down and purchase. But in the case of what I'm doing multi-track recording. I'm using this Roland XV-5080 to record one track at a time. So it's not, I guess, the end of the world if when I'm recording drum loops into my recording device or my DAW, that I just temporarily set this to 1/4 of the actual time, I guess. Okay, so to finish off this video, I'm just going to give a little rant about some trouble that I had with the actual plastic housing of the ZuluSCSI Drive. So, like you might have seen before earlier in the video when I was hooking everything up, the problem I had was that I couldn't get the USB-C cable to seat properly into the Zulu Drive because the USB port on it was just I guess printed or machined, whatever you want to call it. You know, it's 3D printing, so it was printed so that it was cantered to the side, to the point where you couldn't actually insert the cable fully into the USB-C port on the other side. So, but yeah, what I think I'm going to do, just so that I can use this plastic housing, is I'm going to take an X-Acto knife or whatever, and maybe a Dremel, we'll see, and just try to hog out this USB-C opening to be wider. You can see by looking at it too that, not only from the picture I showed was it kind of shifted to the side, but from this outside face of it, you've got these like outside corners that butt up directly up to it. So that outer shroud of the of this USB cable, that black plastic outer shroud, is just going to bump up against it and not allow it to mate inside the actual USB port. So that's something I'm going to modify. So I mean, I really hate to dick on these guys because they are creating a life-changing product, but for 174 bucks plus shipping and tax and add-on options, I got to say, man, like the fact that I had to modify the USB opening, and not only that, but like you can't really see it because I really cleaned it up, but I just spent a long time clearing out all these little plastic hairs. It was just full of plastic hairs, which I guess is a growing pain when you're a small-time company trying to do 3D printing. I get it. I get that maybe the technology's not really there yet with small-scale 3D printing, but I mean, like I said, you can't see it now, but when I opened this thing up with the motherboard inside, I mean, it was just full of fucking little plastic hairs, which I'm not a computer scientist, so I don't know if that would fuck up a motherboard, but, I would think that that's certainly not something you'd want. And then the biggest complaint I had about the actual hardware was this came cracked. I don't know if that was a shipping error or maybe a 3D printing error, but there's supposed to be a little plastic piece here. But yeah, this thing was cracked where this little rubber bunghole thing is. So yeah, so I used a razor knife, a razor utility knife, to hog out the USB port to enlarge it. And, the ease at which I was able to remove material is also the reason why this material is just really not reliable. I was trying to be really careful about how I was scraping, with a fresh, sharp blade, and I still really quickly just blew through that wall there over into the adjacent SD card port. This material just fractures really easily. It's extremely brittle. Which makes sense because the way 3D printing works is you're just layering. You can see the striations, the lines. If I can get this fucking thing to focus, yeah. It's just layering layers of plastic on top of each other, so that creates weak bond angles. It's not like it's being cast from something or machined, So, yeah, I mean, like I said, I don't want to dick on these guys too hard because I know that it took some like Stephen Hawking type of shit to figure out how to get like the computer engineering to work for this thing, but maybe it's not their fault. Maybe they just outsourced that last leg of the project, creating the housing, to some like fly-by-night type of Chinese sweatshop that just could do it for them for cheap. I get that they're a small business and, they got to do what they got to do. But like, if I'm spending about 200 bucks on something that does this one job, like, it's like, come on, I shouldn't have to do all that. But all that said, I would still buy this product if I were you. Even with the gripes of this, I would still buy it. It's still the only thing that can do what we need to do here to easily work with samples in 2024 on the Roland XV-5080. And, I also want to reiterate, too, that these guys do have a really great customer service team. Like, I've emailed them a couple times, and they'll get back to you and answer your questions in, like, autistic detail. And even when I bought the product, like, as soon as I, like, got done checking out on the website, they immediately like emailed me and just wanted to confirm. They actually, I tried to buy the regular SCSI device, not the V6.4, and they told me that for what I was doing with the Roland XV-5080, that I was better off using the 6.4, and they guided me on like what type of add-ons were best and whatnot. So like they really do have a great customer service team that wants to hook you up. But like I said, if I have one critique, it's that it's like, yeah, find someone else to 3D print your housings there, buddy. Yeah, and just to reiterate how shitty this plastic is, I mean, like when I remounted the motherboard with these 4 screws, I mean, the plastic is just so weak that these screws aren't really holding their thread into the surrounding material. Like that's loose, and it's going to be loose forever. When I first unscrewed it, I mean, it had the plastic wrapped around the threads that it just like pulled out of itself, you know what I mean? So like I can't even use the screw anymore. Like luckily, like I said, this thing just is going to live in the studio. So whatever, but come on, guys.